Brett Sockold here, helping you make every class Catholic. As you can see from my snazzy new shirt, I was at Divine Mercy Academy today. It's a small, new-ish K-8 school just outside of Baltimore, Maryland, and I was working with the teachers there. It was a delightful day. As is my practice, I want to share with you some things that showed up in our workshop today. 3 things. We were dealing with this question. I put it to the teachers when they're thinking of something they need to teach. I say, what is the existence of this thing that you're teaching, this activity that humans participate in? What does it tell us about the human person that this is an activity that we do? And often that can unlock things for teachers who are looking for a connection with Catholic faith, right? So I went to sit with a group of teachers, and they said, she's the reading coach, right? So she doesn't really do literature. Like, of course, we can do Catholic poems and Catholic short stories and stuff. This is with the little kids. But she said, I gotta get them to parse really basic things, right? They got to be able to sound things out, right? A reading coach. So I'm not sure how I can approach that from a Catholic point of view. And I said, so what are you doing when you do this work, right? And it was like, well, you're cracking a code. Like, reading is a kind of code, and humans are the ones who make the code and crack the code, right? So I said, what if you talk to your kid? What if you said you're a code breaker? That's the kind of thing you are. God made you as a code breaker, and you could tell stories about spies and wars and whatever, right? And it all of a sudden it's cool, right? And then you can think okay, so what kind of a thing are humans that we make this code, language, written language, in this case, written language, that we then share with one another across continents and across centuries so that we can get messages from people who are far away from us in time and space, right? And so you're this, penguins don't do this, giraffes don't do this, humans write down these codes and teach each other how to decode them and pass that on, right? So she thought, well, this would be a lot of fun with the little kids to instead, because they can get frustrated because they're not the best at reading, that's why they're with her. But they're the code breakers now, right? And God made humans to be code breakers and code makers. And what's really interesting is God actually plays this game with us, right? So if God gives us a Bible in human language, it's written down. This is a code, right? That you can learn how to read, and then you can engage with it, and then you're in on all the information that God wants to share with you in the Bible, right? So she thought this was super cool, and we bounced around a bunch of ideas about how even how you'd set up the classroom to introduce the idea that we're code breakers and welcoming the code breakers into the room and having a code breakers club. We really went to town with it. But I thought, notice the question, right? What are humans doing when they do this? When humans read, it's a kind of code making, and writing is a kind of code making, and reading is a kind of code breaking. We're decipherers, right? And that's unique human quality. And God uses that unique human quality to speak to us and to interact with us. So we thought that was super cool. I was very excited about that one. Another group at the same time, and they were talking about music. So what kind of thing are we humans that we would not only have music, but in this particular case, that we would sing together, right? Choral music. What kind of creature does that? And we noticed it's one of the preferred metaphors, maybe the preferred metaphor in our tradition for what we're going to do forever in heaven is sing in a choir, right? And people can think well, that's kind of boring. I don't want to sing for 10,000 years and just be getting started, And of course, our human imaginations fall short. We can't, even things we love doing, our very favorite things, we don't want to do them for sort of an infinite amount of time. But of course, one of the things we can actually experience in this life is a sort of timelessness. When you're immersed in something, including choral singing, you can actually lose track of time, which is a very helpful complement to thinking about doing something you like forever, is that if you lose track of time, that tells you something about heaven too, because one thing you're not going to do in heaven is get bored, right? And so something about the timelessness, it's not just more and more time, but there's something timeless about that. And our human experience in many activities, including choral singing, can be one of timelessness. But there's also this beautiful thing about it that is about communion, right? When we sing with one another, it says something about being made for community, right? So one of the Bible verses that came up in our conversation was, "It's not good for man to be alone," right? When we sing together, we're affirming our communal nature, and we're doing what we're built for, right? Especially if we're using our voices to praise God. This is kind of the final end of music, the final goal of music, so that it becomes our image of heaven, is choirs of angels and saints praising God forever, right? And then here's the last one, and this was a fun one, because I get this question sometimes. A group will put up their hand, and I'll come over and they say, "Well, we're doing math, so like, what do you got, Doc?" Right? And they'll throw something out at me like, "Oh, we're factoring polynomials. How are you going to Catholic that?" But this time, they didn't ask me. They didn't say, "What do you got for that?" The teacher actually had thought quite a bit about this, and she said, "Well, we're factoring polynomials, and I want them to notice when they're doing this work, the kind of thing that is required of them and how it is reflective of their humanity." And in particular, I want them to notice that there is a pattern and a procedure, right? So we're watching for patterns very carefully, and we have to notice if it's one of these kinds of things, then we follow procedure A, and if it's one of these kinds of things, we follow procedure B, and we sort of build out our own algorithm, right, as we walk through the process. But none of it works if we're not very good noticers, if we're not paying very careful attention. And then she said something, this connection really impressed me. She said she thought of Mendeleev laying out the periodic table of the elements, where he's got, the different elements are sort of squares with different characteristics, and he's laying them out and he's moving them around and he's recognizing patterns so that he can start ordering them. And she said it's also what we do in biology when we're categorizing animals or plant species and labeling them. And then it hit me like, what does Adam do in Genesis, right? Like, almost the first thing is he names the animals, right? The human role in creation is a kind of like noticer, recognizer, categorizer thing, right? And whether we're doing it in science or in math, humans are the ones who are supposed to be paying attention to the world. And it reminded me, Simone Weil has an essay. It's called "Reflections on the Right Use of School Studies with a View to the Love of God." Actually, if you're a member of my online community, I made a recording of this for you guys for a Christmas present. So you can check that out in the online community. But in this essay, Simone Weil talks about St. John Vianney, who's a famous priest, perhaps most famous for two things. One is he was miserable at Latin, and he almost didn't make it through seminary because he couldn't wrap his head around Latin. And second, for being a very famous confessor. He would sit in the confessional for 15 hours a day, and people would come from all around the country to go to confession with him because he was so perceptive in the confessional. And what Simone Weil suggests in this essay is the long hours that he put into Latin, even if he never got good at Latin, those long hours paid dividends in the confessional because they made him very attentive. He had to focus and he had to pay attention. And that's a very transferable skill, right? And Weil's point in this essay is this skill, which we want in life, we want to be able to be attentive, is actually primarily of value to us in prayer, right? If prayer is a struggle, it's very often because we're having trouble being attentive in the moment because our minds wander. And so we thought, factoring polynomials, getting good at factoring polynomials, or any number of other such sort of sequential patterned things, whether it's in math or science or even diagramming a sentence, these sort of sequential pattern things, when you focus on them, what happens is your fragmented mind becomes more ordered, right? And we live in a culture where our minds are just fragmented, right? Every time a ding goes off, I turn off the sound on my phone because I can't focus. If I'm driving a car and my phone starts to ding, I'm just like, Now, I'm worse than maybe a lot of people, but lots of us experience this fragmentation of mind, and we love the possibility of having an ordered mind, right? Having it all together, knowing where our thoughts are, knowing what we're focused on. And and of course, how will our minds be in heaven? Will our minds be fragmented in heaven, or will they be well ordered in heaven? And what would we desire? And so, in factoring a polynomial, right, or any number of other such sequential sort of operations, we're building a capacity that serves us well in this life, but which is already ordered towards the next life, first in prayer, but then in our time, or time is not the best word, in eternity, with God and with the saints and angels forever in heaven. And we start that process through practices that order our mind rather than fragment our mind, like engaging in our experience of reality, which is what education is, or should be, right? It should be an experience of reality by doing something like factoring a polynomial. So I find these days so fun, because before the day starts, I could never predict where this is going to go. But I've got this series of questions that I put to teachers, and it doesn't matter what they bring to it. They end up finding something that makes a connection for them. And I hope you notice about these connections, they're not like arbitrary, right? They're not like weird tack-on connections where the Catholic feels kind of forced, but they're actually a really integrated sort of approach to what it is we're doing in the classroom. And it reinforces a Catholic worldview for the teachers, and then, of course, for their students. So delighted to share that with you. Thanks to Divine Mercy Academy for this sweet sweater, and we'll catch you next time making every class Catholic. God bless.